Hi, it's Chris Moore with Senior Remodeling Experts. Welcome to Aging in Place is a Team Sport. It's a video series where we talk to different providers. We explore how families, professionals, and communities can come together to help older adults live safely, comfortably, and independently at home. I'm here to guide you, connect you with the right resources, and help make the rest of your life the best of your life. Welcome back to Aging in Place is a Team Sport. I'm delighted to have with me today Joe Withrow with the Phoenician League. And Joe is in the realm of finance. We all know that in order to age in place successfully, you need to have some finances in this world of ours. Joe, tell us just a little bit about your background and what you do and how you help people get their financial house in order.
Yeah, and Chris, I'm just so honored to be with you today. Thanks so much for having me on, and I love the work that you do. I think it is so important and in some ways overlooked. And so for me, my background, I call myself a reformed corporate banker. So I started in the corporate banking world mainly because that's who gave me a job. But I was lucky in a sense that I actually worked in the loss mitigation department at Wells Fargo during the mortgage crisis. If you remember back to those days, Wells Fargo was the bank that got in trouble for robo-stamping foreclosure documents when the crisis hit. So they were just signing off on foreclosures without ever reading the documents or doing whatever verification needed to happen. And that came out on the news, and then that created a big backlash. And that's when the US government came in and started and said, no, we can't have this. You guys need to modify these loans, figure out how to make the mortgage, stop all these things, the foreclosure from happening. So the incentive completely flipped. And Wells Fargo, they laid off a bunch of people in the foreclosure building, and they hired a bunch of young guys like me in the loss mitigation department to try to clean up the mess. So I saw all that from a front row seat, which opened my eyes to a lot of things. What we're told is happening isn't always what is taking place. And there were quite a few underlying ulterior motives involved there. So anyway, I started out in corporate banking, but I didn't like it. And the things I saw made me question a lot of what I thought I knew about it. So I transitioned into the investment research space from there. And that was my second career. It catapulted me. It kind of helped me create the Phoenician League, which is our investment strategy group that I've put together. And I'm just so thankful that we've got a good core group of members with today.
So you had talked about the loan modifications, and I actually got one of those loan modifications.
Did you?
And
Okay.
I did. I was at 8 3/4. I started my business in 2001. I was doing new construction. We were building, $1 million houses. People were, 06, 07. The idea was, man, you can build any size house you want and you're going to be fine because, the housing market is going to keep going up. And it did until it didn't. And when, it stopped going up, it is, as you well know, it came down with a crash. And so I was able to get my mortgage modified from 8 3/4 to 4 3/4, which, worked out good for me. But I remember you saying that, you had the audacity to bring up that, are these modifications really, helping people? It seems like some of these are being, the balance on the loan is way more than the property's worth. And what was the response you got to that?
Yeah. And so it's interesting, just a little context with that, so when somebody defaults on their mortgage, those late payment fees start to accrue, every month. Those things are just adding up to that past due balance. And then after so many months, the bank basically hires a foreclosure attorney, and that attorney starts billing for fees and costs. And so that's what I started to see. So for some people who might not have had all these fees built up, modifications probably worked out okay. But there were plenty of people that I saw where they had been past due and they would have, maybe $10,000 or more just worth of fees piled up in their past due balance, and the bank did not forgive those fees. They just put them back at the end of the loan. And so I started to see that, hold up, as you mentioned, at that time, I think on average in this country, real estate prices came down around 30%. But in some cities, they came down 50% or more. And so I started to see that at the same time the house prices going down, we're sticking people with an even bigger mortgage than what they had before. And so I raised my hand in the meeting and I just asked a basic question, and that is, anybody tracking, the loan to value for these modifications that we're doing? Because we weren't doing it. That wasn't part of our process. And my thinking was, I am fairly certain that I had done some modifications where the mortgage balance that the modified mortgage balance was greater than the home value. And of course, good underwriting says that that home should never be worth, I'm sorry, the good underwriting says that the loan on the home should never be worth more than 80% of the value. So the home should be worth more than the mortgage. And that's just sound underwriting. So I asked that question, and the boss at the front, he's just kind of scowled and was like, that's not for you to worry about. Just keep your head down and do your job. And I started to realize, I was in my 20s at that time. And most of the people that they hired in that department were around my age. And I started to realize they didn't want people who had more experience coming in and asking questions. They just wanted somebody who would keep their head down and do what they're told. And so that was kind of a wake up call for me that they were not interested. And then the other thing I found out was that the US government was paying them a flat fee for every modification that they did. And so their incentive was just to do the modification. Don't worry about the details. And then I started to realize, oh, so this is their plan to get their bonus for this quarter. Even though everything's crashing, they've got, they're getting paid to do these modifications. And so I realized that there was some underlying at best conflicts of interest and at worst corruption. So that was my experience.
So Joe, as you know, we work with people, and I'm very interested in helping people live a full and productive life throughout the course of their life. And the whole idea of retirement is one that really hasn't been around that long from a historical perspective, but everybody kind of looks at it as, that's the conventional wisdom. You reach 65 and you sail off into the sunset and hope that you've got a nest egg. Your book, Beyond the Nest Egg, which kind of looks at this model and maybe brings up the question, is this really the best model going forward? So kind of from a 30,000 foot view, what is your experience and your knowledge is sounded overall for most people in terms of how do you manage your money in a way that will serve you throughout your life?
Yeah, there's a couple layers to it, but I just think back, number one, I think just understanding the history. And if you look at, the financial planning industry as it exists today, it really has only been in existence since since the 1970s and more into the 1980s. So there was legislation passed in 1974 called the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974. And then there was subsequent legislation that created qualified retirement accounts. And so what we are told to do today, and we've got now several generations that have been told, you save your money in these qualified retirement accounts. Usually people buy funds in those accounts or whatever. In case you don't have many choices. And it's just assumed you put your money in and you try to work up to whatever number you need so that you can retire and sell off your funds and then live on the income. And we just all, that's what we're all told. But if you look at it, that's a very new idea. Prior to that, up until these qualified retirement accounts were created, Americans, they relied on, number one, defined contribution plans, which were basically corporate pensions, as well as Social Security, which at that time, if you go back to the 70s, Social Security was running in the green. It was bringing in more money than it was paying out. And then people had bank savings. They had savings in the bank and certificates of deposits, things like that. And it worked fine because at that time, interest rates had not been manipulated lower. So you could buy a bank CD and make, whatever percentage you'd make, and you could get a real return on that investment. And up until 1971, the dollar was still tied to gold. And so really up until the 70s, we didn't have to worry about inflation in this country, where prices for everything would just rise consistently. And that was because in August 15, 1971, President Nixon cut the dollar's final link to gold. And that kind of unleashed a massive wave of inflation in the 70s that we also had to deal with a couple of years ago, something similar. But prior to that, if you go back even further, if you go back to 1933 and before, the US dollar was directly backed by gold. And so the paper dollars, the paper bills that people had, it said on that bill, there is deposited at the US Treasury, 1 ounce of gold or 10 ounces of silver backing this note, whatever the number was. And you could actually go to the bank and you could turn in your paper dollars and they'd give you gold coins or silver coins, whatever it was that was backing the note. And so people at that time understood that these paper bills we have, they're not money. They are representations of money. And at that time, they were a claim check on gold or silver. And so it's not the paper that was important, it was the underlying metal that provided the value. And that was all. So in 1933, they outlawed gold. FDR, he made it illegal for Americans to own gold, and he required Americans to turn in their gold to their banks, and they were sent, through the Federal Reserve System. So anyway, not to ramble on too much, but I think it's very important to understand that the dollar we have today is not really money. Because it has no tangible value whatsoever. And they're creating trillions of dollars a year out of thin air, which devalues the purchasing power of the dollars that we all hold. And so it's, in a sense, it's legal counterfeiting, because if we were to do this, we'd go to jail. But when the Federal Reserve does it, the US government does it, they have legal parameters to where, but it has the same negative impacts. And so we start there and we look at what's the foundation of personal finance, and it's savings. But we've had several generations now that really has not been able to truly have savings, because they've manipulated interest rates lower. And so your savings account at the bank or your certificate of deposit doesn't really pay much. And the value of the dollar constantly falls. It's one of those things where, we need to look at protecting our purchasing power first and foremost before we ever go into the investment realm. So when I look at 1Ks, IRAs, those things, those aren't savings to me. Those are investments, because your money can go down. Now, I understand the market has largely gone up, most of the time over the last 40 years, but there are periods where it has not, and it's fallen dramatically. And so anyway, I think starting with savings is where we need to look.
The basic point that gold is money, everything else is credit. And the fact that our dollars today are fiat currency really is, it says based on the full faith and credit of the United States government. And so basically we're saying, we think the United States government is stable and not going to collapse and will honor its obligations. And that's really all it's based on. So I wanted to bring up, it's interesting because in your program, and I'll ask you more about this later, you talk a lot about real estate, and you talk about whole life insurance. And when I bought my first house, when I was in my 20s, and I had a mortgage, and the mortgage company offered me, mortgage life insurance. And I had, some older gentleman that I went to church with that explained to me that the mortgage life insurance is for the benefit of the mortgage company. It's not really for your benefit. And he happened to be affiliated with A.L. Williams, and A.L. Williams was famous for coining the phrase "buy term and invest the difference." And so I went to this program with him, and learned that whole life insurance was a terrible idea, and you were throwing your money away, and you should buy term insurance and put the money in the market. And really, all of my adult life, I kind of had that belief system. I was talking about that was of the belief that whole life was not a good thing, and that buy term and invest the difference is what smart people did. And then I heard you talking about whole life, and then I heard Garrett Gunderson, who has a book called What Would the Rockefellers Do? And he's talking about whole life insurance. My whole viewpoint on life insurance has been stood on its head.
Yeah. So I think it comes down to the understanding that life insurance policies are very customized, and there's lots of things you can do. Now, if all you're doing is just buying the actual life insurance, then where the insurance company pays you a death benefit, or pays your beneficiary a death benefit when you pass away, if that's all you're doing, then you're not really accruing much value in that policy. But there are ways to structure these policies such that you're basically creating accelerated cash value growth inside the policy itself. And that cash value is tangible value that you can basically access for any reason at any time. And so you can pull money out of the policy to use it for whatever you want. And so you start there, and then you start to think generationally. And it's a situation where the way we advocate whole life insurance at the Phoenician League, we talk about max funded life insurance. And so it's not about buying the insurance. It's about creating a strategic cash warehouse within the policy itself. And so the way that works is the insurance company pays a dividend to the policy every year based on their earnings. And so the policy grows. Contractually, it's going to grow at it's got a minimum rate of return within the policy itself. The cash value is going to grow at a minimum amount every year. And it's a small minimum. but the insurance company also pays a dividend that accelerates that cash value growth. And so when we're talking about life insurance, we're not really talking about the death benefit part. Although when we start thinking generationally, we can incorporate that. But first and foremost, it's a means of warehousing cash within this policy that is going to grow, but you can access it at any time. And so you can take a loan against your cash value and you could go make an investment with it if you wanted to. And then that investment, does its thing and your policy, your cash value is still going to grow in the policy. Or if you had an emergency of some kind, or maybe you wanted to buy land or, whatever the case is, help your kids with a down payment on their first home, whatever it is, you've got cash value in this policy. But what's very advantageous about it is you take a policy loan, there are no repayment terms whatsoever. There is an interest rate. And my thing is always pay the interest every year. It's simple interest. So it's not compounding. It's very small. It's not like a bank loan where that interest is compounding all the time. It's a very, very easy payment to make, but you never have to pay the principal back if you don't want, and the policy will still grow over time. And when you pay that interest, it's revenue to the insurance company, increases their earnings, and then they pay you a dividend. They pay all policyholders a dividend based on how well they do each year. So theoretically, when you pay that interest, you're getting some of it back in the dividend. It's not quite the same as paying interest to yourself. I've heard people say it that way, and that's not correct. But anyway, the idea is it's a mechanism of savings that can keep up with inflation. And it does shelter your money because it's cash value in a policy. It's not money sitting in the market. It's not tied to any type of market risks. And then what it gets really exciting is if you start to think generationally. And so what I've done for my children is I've set up a policy for each of them. And my daughter she's about to have a birthday. She's going to be 11. My son's birthday is tomorrow. He's going to be 7. So when they were born, I set up a policy because the cash value grows a lot faster when the person's younger. Because that's just how insurance works. But my thought process is when they're 21 years old, these policies are going to have over 6 figures worth of cash value. And at that point, or whenever I'm confident that they are responsible enough to handle the money, I'll sign these policies over to them. And that could be whether it's college funds or start a business or whatever it is they want to do. But until then, the cash value is mine to access, and I make investments with it and things like that. And so it's not really about the life insurance, but then you think generationally, at some point, somebody's going to inherit a lot of money with these life insurance policies. So the death benefit, when you structure it this way, grows over time as well. And so the death benefit gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Somebody's going to inherit that money. And if they understand the strategy, they can set up even bigger policies on their children or their grandchildren. And you kind of create a family bank. That's the idea. And so one generation has to get it started, but you set them up on the kids, educate your kids about these things or grandkids. And you can just have this pool of money that continues to grow within your family. And it's about, putting an end to the rat race. And so even folks who are older, even if the setting up life insurance on yourself might not really work that well, you can still look at this strategy for your kids and your grandkids. And it can be a way to really kind of create some financial independence within your family. So, but if you're going to structure these policies correctly to where your cash value grows, that's when you don't even have to make the choice, because you can set up the whole life, max funded whole life. And then you can make investments out of your policy, and your whole life and your policy is still growing. So you get both. Now you don't have to make that distinction. And I read Dave Ramsey, he was big on buy term and invest the difference. And I kind of, some of his basic stuff was very sound, but I see there's really this, it's all part of Retirement Incorporated in my mind, like trying to drive people into the financial markets. So this is a way to create, to warehouse cash outside of the market.
So I guess for people who are maybe just recognizing that maybe, all the financial belief systems that they've held near and dear all their life might not be as sound as they've been told. Kind of what's a good place to start? Because once you start questioning all of your beliefs, it's like, well, what can I believe? And what is really true, and what is a bedrock, and what is a place that I can kind of find some firm footing and build from there. Because it's really when people put all their stock in the stock market, right? Yeah. And then there's a big crash. I mean, you look back at in 1929 and our grandparents and what they went through. and destroys your whole world.
Yeah, you read stories about that. Some people who really, I mean, lost everything in 1929. But the good thing back then is that America was still very agrarian. And so there were still so many people who just lived on self-sufficient
Hmm.
farms. And they didn't really care. I mean, it's not that they didn't have empathy for what was happening, but they weren't in the markets. They were, they were just working on their farm. They didn't have, they weren't losing money in these things. So I think just my perspective, Chris, I start there and it's like what's really important in life. And I think everything starts just right at the household level. And that's, I know the work you guys do with helping people stay in their homes and having a comfortable place to live. I start right there. And for me, I have extra, I've got some extra food and water and extra, like everything I use on a daily basis, I keep extra of it in the house. So if there was some type of emergency, I know we've got plenty of extra here. We don't have to scramble or anything. And so I call that home resiliency. And it just starts right there. What's important? And the most important thing is your health and your family's health and safety and those things. So I start there. And that's not even financial. And then you work your way out and if you look at what do I have financially speaking? Do I have a nest egg? Have I accumulated some money? And the first thing you've got to do is protect, some of it, take some of it and make sure you're protecting its purchasing power. And I'll just share with you my thoughts on this and my philosophy and understanding that, some of these things may or may not be relevant to everybody. It's just kind of everybody's situation is different. But I just start with gold. And I create, this is what we help people in the Phoenician League do. We create an asset, what I call an asset allocation model. And if you have a nest egg of some kind, doesn't matter what the number is, you take that, whatever that number is, and you say, well, what percentage of this do I want to make sure that purchasing power is protected no matter what? And for me, I think, 8 to 10% in gold is a good place to start because gold it's generational wealth. It's been money for thousands of years. There is still, even though the modern economists like to disparage it, there's still an active gold market in every country on this planet. Every central bank in the world still owns gold. The United States gold just this week, it's in dollar terms, gold's over $3,800 an ounce today. U.S. government now owns over $1 trillion worth of gold. They still, as long as they still have it. There's questions about, well, nobody's audited Fort Knox or anything, but assuming they still have it, they've got over $1 trillion worth of gold. So I look at gold, and that's kind of a cornerstone, and that's just savings. That's not an investment. Gold's been up tremendously. It's been one of the best performing assets recently. I don't care about that because my thought process isn't I'm going to put dollars in now and try to get more dollars out later when the price goes up. That's not how I think. I see gold as money, as savings. And so I put dollars in because I don't want to hold the dollars. I don't trust the dollars. I trust the gold. So start there. I like Bitcoin too for the same reasons, but I recognize, especially for folks who are older, a lot of them are not comfortable with the technology. And that's fine. For those who are, there are simple ways to own Bitcoin that don't require some of the technological activity. But I see Bitcoin as similar to gold in just the same way for the same reasons, because it's a scarce asset. There's only 21 million Bitcoins that will ever exist, and 19.89 million Bitcoins are already here. But the last Bitcoin's not going to be mined until the year 2140, which is 100 plus years from now. And it's just an incredibly scarce asset. And so if you run the numbers and you just look at the population, and I forget off the top of my head, so don't quote me on this, but this is going to be rough estimate. If everybody in the world said they wanted to own wanted to own Bitcoin, there's enough Bitcoin for people to own like 0.18 Bitcoins. So just a very small fraction of a Bitcoin. So it's incredibly scarce. And I see Bitcoin just like gold. And personally, I allocate a little bit of money to Bitcoin too. But again, that's completely optional for those who are not comfortable with the idea or the technology. But those are savings. And then we talked about the max funded life insurance. And I see that as savings as well. That's better than saving money in the bank. And so that's kind of the cornerstone. And then for me, when we look at kind of the conventional retirement model that we talked about before, and the idea is to buy these financial assets and just keep buying them for 30 or 40 years and hope they go up and up and up. And then when you're ready to retire, you just start selling those assets. And then that's your money that you live on. The challenge there is the moment you sell that asset, you got to pay taxes on it, unless you're in a Roth IRA. But if it's a regular 401k, regular IRA, you've got to pay taxes on it. So you don't get all the money, you get a portion of it, and you're at the liberty of the tax rate, which could go up or down. We don't know. And then you get that money that's left over, but you don't have the asset anymore. And so you're gradually drawing down what you worked your entire life for, just to live, just to create income for yourself. And so when I look at that, I think, and I know that model's worked out okay for a lot of people. I recognize that, but I also look at it, I'm like, that's kind of a roundabout way to go about it. All you're trying to do is create income. Well, there are investments you can make to do that right away. And in the Phoenician League, we look at investment real estate and we look at investing in mortgage notes, which is just buying mortgages that are trading on the secondary market, that are selling on the secondary market, not as a security, but actually buying the promissory note to where when somebody makes their mortgage payment, the principal and interest portion comes to you every month. That becomes your cash flow. And we use professional loan servicers. So it really is not that complex or complicated. It doesn't require a lot of specialized knowledge. In buying mortgages, when you first hear that, you think, well, gosh, $200,000, whatever mortgages are. Well, there's a whole wide range of mortgages, including mortgages that are trading in that still have a very small, relatively small amount. So it doesn't require you to be massively wealthy to do these things. I mean, you can buy a mortgage for several $1,000s if you want to. That's probably going to have a shorter term. But the way I look at it is I want to have some of my money parked in assets that are going to protect it. And then I want to have some of the money, I want to use it to create streams of income for me. And that's monthly income. And there's no restrictions to it. When you've got income in a retirement account, you can't touch it until you're 59 and a half years old, or you could, but they'll penalize you 10%. 10% right from you if you touch it before you're 59 and a half, and you got to pay taxes on it. But with these other investments, you don't have those restrictions. And then the other thing we help folks do is we implement tax strategies to make sure that we're not paying too much in taxes on that income too. But that's the way I think about it. And we do a little bit of investing in the stock market too. But to me, that's completely optional. And if you're comfortable with that, I would not I would not put more than 8 to 10% of my money in the stock market, compared to the conventional idea, which says, when you're younger, 80% stocks and 20% bonds, and then you gradually kind of flip it from there. But that's the way we approach it, is just being very strategic with, we've got to protect purchasing power. And then if we can create extra streams of income as well, we can do that. And then you live on that and you don't have to sell anything. You have the asset and the income. So it's putting both on the same team.
Which makes so much sense. And I brought up Garrett Gunderson earlier, and he talks about investor DNA. It's what's going to keep you up at night, or what kind of peace of mind, because that's a big part of it too. I mean, if it's going to stress you out, then it's
don't do it.
Yeah,
most likely, but unless you can get comfortable with it. But anyway.
Yeah, you brought up agrarian society. I grew up on a farm in Rockbridge County, not far from you.
Oh, I love it.
And
beautiful country.
Yeah.
I mean, this, to my way of thinking, this is the most beautiful part of the world. And I haven't been to many parts of the world, so I'm biased. But it's just beautiful. I mean, this is Thomas Jefferson's country.
Yeah.
This is what he envisioned for America.
Yeah. But my grandfather bought that farm in 1948. And my dad was right out of high school when they moved there. And he told me that in talking to the old timers that they said that during the Depression, if you owned your farm outright, you were fine. You could grow enough food and barter with the neighbors. But if you had a mortgage on your farm and you had to come up with the cash to make the mortgage payments, that's when it was difficult. During that time, because there wasn't any cash.
Gotcha.
Makes
sense. Yep.
So
that makes perfect sense. And it's just about protecting your own, because our home, our property, whatever farm, that's our slice of the world. So that's our safe place, especially if it produces things that help,
right? That feed you or clothe you, or that kind of thing, for sure. Well, Joe, if we have viewers that are interested in learning more about the Phoenician League, about what you have to offer, how do they go about finding that?
Yeah, so our website is PhoenicianLeague.com, and I'll spell that out because I know the words might not be familiar. The name itself is a play on two separate entities: the ancient Phoenician civilization from biblical times, which is where modern day Lebanon is today. But this was a commercial civilization. So these were the guys going around creating trade routes throughout the Mediterranean, and they were kind of linking up the Asia and China, and with really all the Mediterranean and parts of Western Europe as well. And what I really, really inspires me is these guys were all about mutual, doing win-win deals, doing mutually beneficial commercial activity, where most of the other tribes, or whatever we call them, nations, whatever, they were going around trying to conquer their neighbor and take their stuff and, enslave their men and all these things. And the Phoenicians were trying to build a mutually beneficial society, and I really appreciate that. And then the league part of the Phoenician League is a play on the old Hanseatic League of the Middle Ages, which is mostly in where Germany is today. But it was a network of free trading city states. And so they were independent city states. It was before Germany was a unified country. It was before Europe had unified nation states. But within this network, they had a commercial code. They actually created their own code of commercial law called the Lex Mercatoria, which has formed the foundation of our international commercial code today. But they had their own code of law, and they had very deliberate framework for you must honor your contract. And, if you don't, there are repercussions, and here's what those are. And it created an environment where people could trust each other without necessarily knowing each other personally. And that created a very large trade network that would not have otherwise existed. So we really try to embody those principles. We want to build a network. We want to be mutually collaborative, mutually supportive. That's those types of things in a world that today is so politicized and so, I'm horrified by some of the stuff I read and I hear. So anyway, PhoenicianLeague.com, that's PhoenicianLeague. And we've got a little thing where a little sign up form there if you want to sign up on our distribution list. We'll do strategy sessions or webinars from time to time, and we're going to do one next week. Next Wednesday, I believe it is. I'm not sure when this podcast will go out, but anyway, if you sign up on that distribution list, we'll send out to you whenever we do another session. If you care to join and learn more, Chris, this was great. Really appreciate you having me on.
Yeah.
I thoroughly enjoyed it, even with the technical difficulty, and I'm just so appreciative that you thought of me. So
absolutely,
I appreciate it.
And I've just barely touched the surface on your content, and I'm trying to get this book out. I'm recording a webinar a week. I've got my 5th one this week, so there'll be 12 webinars, and then I'm going to take the recordings, and that'll be the book. And I've got a bunch of speaking engagements. I'm speaking at a housing conference at Virginia Tech in November. I'm speaking at a Job Trade, which is our construction software, project management software, in Dallas in January. And so I've got a lot going on.
You got a lot going on.
I do, and in fact, I've got a phone call with Serena with Tax Sherpa at 2:30. That's our follow up.
Well, I hope they come back with some good strategies for you. They've worked wonders for me. They're so unconventional at first, at least my experience. At first, I was kind of like, it's just, I'm not sure exactly. But once I got into it, I was like, wow, this is great. They've transformed my situation. So I'm confident that they'll come back with some good stuff.
Well, the traditional CPAs are like traditional, financial advisors. They're like, this is the way we do it, and that's the way, and that over there, especially, I don't know, that might be a little sketchy, so that might be a red flag. So we won't, we won't take that one. Well, it's either legal or it's not.
Right. That's it. There's no shades of gray. But it's especially the younger ones. I was working before I linked up with Tax Sherpa. I was working with more of a traditional CPA firm, and it was founded by a guy who he was in his 60s, and he was really good, and he'd take the time to talk with me and do these things. But he got to the point he had hired some younger guys, and he was kind of transitioning out of the business where he still owned it, but he didn't want to work anymore. He wanted to hire these young guys. And the young guys just were nothing like him. They wouldn't take the time to be strategic. They wouldn't think, just, oh, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. And I'd rather have the question, well, how can I do it? Under what circumstances can I do it? Can we create an environment? So anyway, they've been a breath of fresh air to me, even though they are very unconventional. But the results they've worked for me, I'm paying much less in taxes than I otherwise would. Yeah. And I'm paying them some of that money, but they've earned it.
There you go. All right, Joe. Well, thank you. All right. Very good.